Welcome back to another episode of Buckle Up with Simon and Brian. How are you doing this evening, Simon?
I'm doing great. I'm right back from Tahoe Rim Trail 100 mile in Tahoe. That's easy. It was such a great race, Brian. I think it's one of my favorite races so far. Beautiful, scenic, great aid station. Aid station with thematic. There was a Star Wars aid station, a Flintstone aid station. We had lunch after the race. It was just the perfect race. I struggled a lot though, but it was an absolutely wonderful experience. But how about yourself, Brian? How are your knees?
My knees are well. I spent the weekend in the high country. I was flagging the first 75 miles of the Summit 200. It was great to be out there. I think I spent about 30 hours out on the course, just flagging the heck out of it. It was great. So my knees are doing well. Good training weekend. Maybe not as fast as I'd like to go, but good time on feet.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really curious to see how Summit 200 will go. I think we both have the same thinking, which is that sounds like a wonderful event. I also think it's the first year, so I'm gonna wait a little bit. But an absolutely amazing race in the mountain. But actually, for Tahoe, I was at altitude and struggled a little bit with the heat, struggled a little bit with altitude, and particularly what was challenging for me was that at some point I just was not able to eat and I was not able to drink enough to keep up with the effort in general. That was a huge struggle for me.
Well, that's a great segue into our guest this afternoon, this evening. It is Alex Larson from Alex Larson Nutrition. She shared with us just now a bunch of tips about heat, humidity, high peaks, body composition, all things nutrition. It was a really great conversation with Alex. She brought a lot of great information to our ultra running space.
Yeah, I was really excited to have her on the podcast. It's the second episode that we have a dietitian joining, and I think there's so much to be said about nutrition, fueling, hydrating for these events. That one guest was not enough to cover that, and we'll have more in the future. We're trying, of course, to vary a little bit the question that we're asking to explore different aspect of it, but just like any medical field, there's also some level of clinical practice. So hearing their opinion about certain question, for example, one of the questions that we explored briefly was fasting and also how to work on body composition, which I think was a really interesting point that she was bringing up.
Yeah, exactly. As a coach myself, I have some low level certifications of coaching certifications and in my own experiences. And I'm not a dietitian, but I do get a lot of questions about it. So it's great to reinforce it with some real dietitians that actually have the training and just kind of get that information out there and kind of clear the muddy water a little bit. I think nutrition is one of the aspects where, for athletes, we're all trying different things and we're trying to see what sticks to the wall. And sometimes hearing it from a credible source, somebody with lots of education in the space, a professional, just kind of helps solidify that. We appreciate you guys listening. We would love to hear your comments about the episode and maybe some comments about future episodes that you'd like to hear. Without further ado, here's Alex Larson. Enjoy. Hi, Alex. Welcome to the show. How are you doing this evening?
Hi, Brian. Hi, Simon. Thanks for having me.
Alex, I wanted to talk about you have a nutrition business. You're coming on to kind of maybe give us some pointers, some guidelines, maybe some structure to how we should be eating in these summer racing months for us. It's hot. We're going to high altitudes. Some of us, a majority of us here coming up pretty quick. At least Simon and I will be going up to altitude. And we wanted to kind of touch on that. But before, let's take a step back. And how did you find yourself in this nutrition role? Where did that come from?
Yeah, I grew up with a family of nurses. Both my parents were in nursing, and so the medical jargon was always at the dinner table most nights. And so I knew I wanted to go into healthcare, but I'm really, really bad with blood and needles. Like my parents are like embarrassed by how terrible I am with them. And so I knew I needed to go into something a little bit different path than nursing. And I ended up as a dietitian. And when I started my career as a registered dietitian, I also really got into triathlon and endurance sport. And I really just fell in love with the endurance athlete community. And it wasn't until 2014, so I was a few years into my career, when I did Ironman Wisconsin. And when I crossed that finish line, I noticed that there's a lot of people that that can use some help with their nutrition. And that's where this whole thing started, where I started to feel my calling. And I started Alex Larson Nutrition a few years ago and haven't looked back. It's just been such a joy to be able to help athletes feel their best, fuel for really great races and training, and not just like feeling great in like races, but also just having great energy like the rest of the day. Because I get a lot of athletes who might go for a long run on a Saturday and then they're absolutely trashed and just on the couch all day long the rest of the day. And I'm like, that doesn't have to be that way. Let's get that nutrition dialed in so that you can have a really great training run and still be a productive human the rest of the day.
It's so funny. I can relate to the dinner table jargon. My wife currently is a nurse, has
Oh,
been for
nice.
16 years, and I grew up with my mother being a nurse. So I've had it throughout my whole life of table talk, which is a little bit different than other people's table talk, probably.
Yes, I would agree. Like it's a very different. You just hear all of these terms all like each and every day. You start to become familiar with them, and it just there's a bit of a nostalgia when you hear it.
I did not choose a medical profession, though, from those. Well, that's a great story. Do you currently still exercise and train for big events, or are you taking a backseat to your profession? What's going on there?
Yeah, I after I finished Ironman Wisconsin, I had also just gotten married, so we were planning on starting a family. It took me about 2 years to get pregnant, though. We went through infertility stuff, so that was kind of my main focus at the time was my family. And so I now have a 7-year-old, a 4-year-old, and an almost 1-year-old baby. So being an athlete and really active in training has not quite been top priority. And so I've been mainly focused on raising kids, but just in the past, I'd say month or so, I've been starting to get back into training, and slow and steady. I'm in terrible shape right now, but I'm excited to get back into doing maybe some half marathons. I'm really interested in starting doing some gravel racing, getting back on the bike. So that's kind of where I'm at right now.
Awesome. That's awesome. Congrats on your family. Gosh, my daughters are 9 and 12, and I was running with a friend who has a 1-year-old, and I blacked out diapers. Like I forgot that there was a whole diaper thing, a whole diaper world, a diaper genie battle between my wife and I. We would stuff diapers into that diaper genie and hope the other person would take it out, until the thing was just this monstrous mess.
Yes, I'm definitely in the world of diapers. I mean, I only have one in diapers right now, which is not too bad, but yeah,
But you but you've been in
yeah,
that world for a while now.
it's been a while. Yeah, I've been pretty much constantly diapers for a long time. I don't know. I mean, my oldest is 7, so yeah, almost 7 years.
Prior to recording, we had mentioned that you had offered like a webinar earlier in the season, like April or something, about heat, humidity, and high peaks, and training, nutrition for that. Can you tell us a little bit that it's like nutrition for summer race conditions masterclass?
Yeah, I have actually hosted 2 master classes this year. One in January that was on specifically body composition for athletes. A lot of athletes that we work with that are looking to have a little bit leaner, stronger body composition. And the one thing that we notice is that when they try and do that on their own, a lot of times they're trying to restrict their eating, and they notice that their performance and their energy levels will just significantly decrease and decline. And so I hosted that masterclass back in January, talking about how to navigate improving body composition while also still having great training. And then in April, I hosted a masterclass, like you said, heat, humidity, high peaks. So how to handle those really warm summer race conditions. And then for a lot of athletes heading to the mountains, heading to higher altitudes, how do you navigate that adjustment in both nutrition and hydration as well?
Gosh, with the recent heat wave that the East Coast has experienced, and I know you're not far enough east, maybe not to experience it yourself, but I think across the East Coast right now, they're in a massive heat wave, 100 plus index, 60, 70% humidity. All the athletes I coach on the East Coast are struggling really hard. They're getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning, trying to run in the dark, maybe getting back out at maybe 9, 10 o'clock at night to try to finish up those long days that they need to get in for their races. So how should they be fueling themselves during this huge heat wave that they're experiencing?
Yeah, the first thing that I hone into is with this heat is first understanding like where they're at in their fueling. So figuring out, okay, how many grams of carb an hour are you taking in? Where do we need you to be on race day? Then like start to put in a plan to how to gradually get you up to that ideal fueling rate. And then hydration is huge. If people aren't staying hydrated, it's going to really take them out of the race pretty quickly, just because when you get dehydrated, it impacts digestion. You're not going to be able to take in fuel very well. Your body temperature is going to raise a lot quicker. Your heart is going to have to work a lot harder, so your heart rate's going to go up. So there's a lot of things physiologically that are going to happen that are going to make the race much more difficult. So number one is figuring out what your sweat rate is, doing it like an in-home sweat test, weighing yourself before and after your workout, drinking a pre-measured amount of fluids, understanding how much fluids on average are you losing in this really hot and humid environment. And then also maybe doing a sweat test on a little bit cooler day, so you kind of understand where your range is in terms of your sweat rate. So that's probably one of the biggest things is once you understand your sweat rate, then you can start practicing an ideal hydration rate. So if you're only taking in small amount of fluids during your runs, then I would start practicing taking in larger volumes of fluid. I think that's really important for a lot of people. People can sometimes, especially for runners, slack a little bit in hydration. And so being really intentional, thinking about, okay, let's say you need to take in 3/4 of a liter of fluid an hour to take in 75% of your sweat rate. That's like what, 5-6 big gulps of water every 15 minutes. And so counting those gulps, having a timer on your watch, making sure that you're getting enough. And that sloshy feeling that some people can experience when they start drinking in those larger volumes of fluid, if you keep practicing that, after about 5 to 7 days, your body will adapt and you won't notice that sloshy feeling anymore. So you kind of have to push through that discomfort just a little bit in order to come out the other side. And that's when people really notice, oh my gosh, I feel so much better finishing this workout than what I did last week. I'm like, yeah, that's because you're actually not incredibly dehydrated and your body, feels a lot better. So there's things like that with hydration where we can put in a little bit of homework and you can go into your race, drink those larger volumes of fluid, stay better hydrated throughout the race and finish a lot.
I'm curious, we talk a lot about water, but you don't mention salt necessarily.
Salt is definitely one that we will look into. If we can do some electrolyte testing, like there's some different sweat testing out there that will give us some information about electrolyte content, then we can make sure that we're concentrating bottles appropriately. So let's say, I'll give myself an example. I had a sweat test done back in May, and I'm actually a very salty sweater. They calculated my sweat rate at 1,700 milligrams of sodium per liter of sweat, which is very high. And so I have to make sure now moving forward, and as I look back on all of my fueling from previous races, I'm like, ooh, I really missed the ball there. But, knowledge is power now. So I know that I have to concentrate my bottles a lot more with electrolytes to be able to replenish those losses, especially during longer duration workouts. If a short half an hour, 45-minute hour run, I can get through that just fine and then replenish those losses afterwards. But for athletes that are out there all day long, even, all night long, you're going to need to replenish those losses, and having a decent concentration of electrolytes to replenish those based off of your sweat rate is where we will really dial that in. I had an ultra runner. He just did a 50K couple weeks ago here in Minnesota, and he actually had his sweat tested the week prior and came back at 2,100 milligrams of sodium per liter of sweat. He was the highest the guy who tested him had ever seen. And so we quickly changed some of his hydration strategies for his 50K. And he said the second loop of that 50K, he was picking off like 20, 22 people that were kind of cramping, slowing way down, and he still felt really strong. He actually had his first loop and second loop were the same exact time. He maintained his pace really consistently throughout there. So he noticed that he usually will have like some abdominal cramping like near his hips when he does longer runs, and he didn't have any of that this time. So it was kind of amazing. Just that little bit of information and those quick tweaks really helped him in his performance.
I'm curious, do you know how, say, like heat adaptation training, how that would affect your sweat test if you have a little bit of training there, like sauna session or heat running?
Yeah, that was something I was talking with the Precision Hydration registered dietitian and their sports scientists. They've found with a lot of their sweat testing that even with like heat acclimatization process, that really only about 10% variance in like fitness level, like your sweat rate is really more genetically determined. And so if you can get an idea of what your sweat rate, you're pretty close, to that rate. No matter where your fitness level is, there's like give or take 10%.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. So that means if you do it, you'll know kind of what you're supposed to do for a pretty long time. We're talking also concentration of what you're hydrating with. I'm curious, what would be, I think we know the consequence of not having enough salt, but what would be the impact if I would take too much? If I would just say, I just assume I'm a salty sweater and I'm just going to use a bunch of it. Of course,
Yeah.
not to the point of being sick, but what
Well, yeah,
would
that
there
can
be any
definitely happen.
consequence?
Yeah,
Yeah.
So for some people, they notice if they're taking in too much salt, they get really thirsty. But yeah, really high salt consumption when you don't need it usually can end up with some GI issues. There can be some fluctuations in the gut, and it can cause some loose stool incidences, which most people, for ultra runners, we know that it's not good to have a code brown, out on the trail. So that would be one of the big ones that would be the likely culprit if you're taking in too much salt.
It's funny because we had that conversation during the race. Someone was just taking a bunch of salt pills and was like, I don't think you can have too many of those. Like, well, I mean, you might puke or shit yourself. So if it does happen, you had too many. But yeah,
Yeah,
who
really
knows?
anything in excess is not good for us. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, but our bodies are to some extent adjusting. Like you don't need to know to the milliliter how much water you need. If you have a little bit too much, you're going to pee a little more. If you have a little bit too less, your pee is going to be more concentrated. And as long as you're within a range, same thing with salt, as long as you're within a range and you don't go crazy taking 2 salt pills every 30 minutes for 30 hours straight, um, you'll, yeah, you'll probably be okay. One other question I have is, I think it's good to know the sweat rate that you have, but at some point, at least for me, I have a limit of how much I can drink, and I really don't know how to how to keep up sometimes. And for example, this weekend I was racing in Tahoe. It went up to 105 at altitude, super dry. I was sweating so much, but at the same time I was totally dry because it would just evaporate very quickly. And I tried my darnest to keep drinking. That was the main thing I was doing, and I could tell I was dehydrated anyway. So I don't know if you have any tips to help people keep up with the volume that they would need to consume.
yeah, it does take a lot of practice, and training is the number one thing that I find. Getting into the habit of every single workout, staying on top of hydration, practicing drinking those larger volumes, and then one thing too is talking with athletes about digestion, understanding that when your body is getting overly hot and like you said, 105 degrees, that's really warm. Your body, once it gets to a certain point, body temperature wise, it's going to slow down digestion a lot because a lot of that blood flow is going to get diverted away to your muscles, to your skin to help it try and keep itself cool. And so when athletes start saying, I couldn't take in anything more, my stomach was getting very bloated, very full. I was very uncomfortable. And I was like, yeah, that is because your gut stopped moving. Like nothing is going to empty from your stomach at this point, where you start maybe noticing that you get a little bit of nausea if you're continuing to drink, continuing to fuel, and you're feeling bloated and that stuff's kind of jostling around. It's a recipe for disaster. And so what you have to do is try and get your body temperature down. You got to slow down. You got to bring your heart rate down. You try and get yourself cooled down any way you can to start getting that gut to move along a little bit more so that you can start to rehydrate yourself again. Otherwise, you're going to end up in the med tent with an IV.
No, that's very helpful. I'm curious also, do you have a sense what would be a normal, like I think we all know for sugar how many grams you can take and kind of where would be the upper limit of, wow, you're very good at absorbing sugar, and past that you're like, that's not going to happen. But I feel for hydration, we don't necessarily have a sense for that. Like someone sweating 2 liters per hour, can they really keep up drinking that much, or they really need to find a way to not be sweating that much by slowing down?
Yeah, I have a couple athletes right now that are, every time they do a sweat test, it's close to 2 liters an hour. And I have one that's doing a really big event in Utah coming up in a couple weeks. And so that's what we're practicing right now, is drinking a 24-ounce fluid bottle every half an hour or so. And because the way he's sweating and how hot it's going to be in Utah, and he's going to be at elevation, I was like, this is the only way you're going to get through this event, because he's tried it before. He's done the event before and he didn't pee the entire day, up into like the later evenings. I was like, that's not healthy. And so that's what we're working on right now. And this is a triathlon that he's doing. So it's, swim, the bike, where it's self-supported. So his spouse is giving him a new bottle pretty much every 30 minutes. And then once he gets on the run, he's going to have a hydration vest that he's like, I don't really want to carry all this. And I'm like, but you don't want to be without. If you're only going to have one stop during the entire marathon that you're going to be able to replenish fluids, I need you to have a lot of fluids on you, and you'll just be drinking that as you go along. That pack will get lighter as you keep going. So yeah, I mean, when you have that highest sweat rate, and you're out in the middle of the woods, it's not a good place to get dehydrated and get disoriented and get sick. I mean, that's miserable. It's not safe.
Yeah, for sure. Totally agree. I'm curious also, I mean, what you mentioned about him is actually interesting. Do you see, because especially in ultra running, we tend to go from aid station to aid station, so it's going to be 5-10 miles. So do you see it as being very negative for someone to say, I'm gonna, how do you say that, camel that, basically, which is you go at the aid station, I'm gonna drink 1 to 2 liter at the aid station and just carry a little bit of water with me? Do you think that's gonna change how well you can tolerate fluid and nutrition? Or you think, as long as you had that many in the 1 or 2 hours period, it doesn't really matter if you just take a little bit all the time?
I think it'll depend on the person. Everyone's a little different. I have one ultra runner that the guy has an absolute iron stomach. He can consume massive amounts of food and fluid and have no issues whatsoever. And then you have other runners who have a very sensitive gut, and they might have to be someone that will have a hydration pack on them, have to be sipping, fueling very gradually throughout that race in order to have their gut tolerate things throughout, from start to finish. So that is very much on a very individual basis on what people's tolerability are.
Alex, you mentioned the home version of a sweat test. You weigh yourself, you go run. I think it's for an hour, if I'm not mistaken, and then you weigh yourself again. It's a rough guesstimate of what you've lost. I mean, it's fairly blunt in its approach, right? but again, to Simon's point, he asked about like the salt content. Where would someone, or what type of test would someone need to get in order to figure out their salt content, or is there some home version for the salt
There
aspect
isn't
of it
really
as
a
well?
home version. There's a few options. Precision Hydration has a sweat test. If you go to their site, they have different sweat test locations. There's some patch kits that you can get. Gatorade has one. I've heard mixed reviews on the accuracy of that one. They'll give you kind of a range of your sweat rate, and it's pretty much like not super helpful from what I've seen. Then the other one that we've had a lot of athletes use is it's like Levelin, I think is how you pronounce it. It's a patch that you get to wear it when you're exercising, and then you send it in with some information, and they will do an analysis and give you a breakdown of all your electrolyte losses and your sweat rate. And then there are some wearable devices. There's H drop, and then I think there's a Nix one as well. Those ones range from anywhere to like 150 to maybe 250. The H drop, from what I've heard, their second generation one is pretty accurate. The Nix I've heard is a little there's mixed reviews on that because it'll just tell you what your electrolyte losses are. It won't tell you specifically what your sodium loss is. So if I were going to go with one, I would probably go with the H drop, but you don't necessarily have to invest in those wearables. There's other ways that you can go about getting that information.
I've had good success with the precision hydration and nutrition testing with a friend of ours, Remo Spagnolo. He tested me in Colorado Springs at the ultra running conference in September of last year. It wasn't.
Colorado has quite a few testing sites. So does California. There's some pockets in the U.S. where they don't have much testing. But if you're traveling anywhere, sometimes I'll have athletes look up, like, oh, you're going to San Francisco? There is a place to get tested.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, the site was really informative. I thought it was helpful as well, just to find those locations around.
Yeah.
I found it interesting, the testing results. That I've been an athlete quite a long time, and none of the information was, I guess, like alarming or news to me. I'm a medium sweater, or medium content of sodium loss and so on and so forth. So it wasn't you know groundbreaking information, but it solidified the fact that I'm doing the right things currently. So I
Yeah.
thought that was helpful.
I was surprised by mine just because when, like, for a lot of salty sweaters, they have like salt stains on their clothing, right? You know, you'll see like white when that sweat dries. I've never had that before. And so I was really quite shocked at how high my sweat rate. But when I think back to my triathlon days, I always off the bike, I would always cramp in my calves on the run. And I'm just like, oh, dang it. Like, I wonder if it was an electrolyte issue, if I just didn't take in, I'm sure I didn't take in enough, especially during Ironman Wisconsin. And yeah, hindsight's always 2020. But if I ever redeem myself again back in triathlons, I'm totally going to just feel like a much different person. And it'll be interesting to see how that performance changes.
Yeah, I've never done it myself. I'm actually curious, as a total neophyte here, what would be the price range? You know, is it really worth the investment for someone who's quite amateur level and then just doesn't
Yeah.
matter really
Yeah.
about performance?
Their dietitian's name is Lexi. When I spoke with her, she said it kind of depends on who's doing the testing, because they usually will do a little bit of a consultation with that appointment. It's not just the sweat test. So she said anywhere from like $100 to $200, somewhere in there, and that includes usually the consultation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not too bad. I mean, it's not something you need to do all the time anyway. As you
Yeah,
said,
it's
if it
just a
doesn't
one-time
change through
test.
time,
Yeah.
yeah, it's really not too bad. The amount of sweating that you do, though, I think is something that you probably need to test. I've seen the difference myself, even with just 2 weeks of sauna session, almost doubling what I can produce. So that you can definitely change. But if the concentration is the same, you'll never need to, or you won't need to do it very often. So that's interesting.
Yeah, I agree.
Alex, I want to back up to one of the first our first conversation and regarding nutrition. I know we got into the hydration side of things. And I always get this question as a coach, and I'm probably butchering the answer, so I'd love to hear your professional answer on it. What's the difference between a calorie and a gram of carbs, or carbs itself? I mean,
Oh, sure.
like how should people be thinking of those things? Because I think in the past we've always been like, oh, 200 calories an hour, 200 calories an hour is a good starting point for fueling and during exercise. And then depending on how that makes you feel, you can adjust either a higher or lower. Um, and then now we're really talking about carbs and not calories anymore. So what's been the change, and why?
Yeah. So I think what you're saying is, so if someone says, how many calories you should be consuming are versus carbs. So for 1 gram of carb, there's 4 calories. So I tend to count, I tend to talk in carbohydrates, but sometimes to give it to put it into perspective for people, I will say, I need you to take in, we'll say 60 grams of carb an hour, and then I'll translate that. And like, that's this many calories an hour. And so far. So just to give them an idea of, this is how many calories I need you to consume in this 3-4 hour long run that you're doing. And so just kind of gives them this thought of like, oh, wow, I need a lot of energy to do this workout. That's really, so for me, I talk carbs mainly, but if people are talking in calories, then usually I'll just say divide by 4 to figure out how many grams of carb are needed.
That's super helpful.
So
So 4 to 1 ratio, and they're almost
yeah,
interchangeable.
yeah. So carbs are a macronutrient, so we get calories from carbohydrates, protein, and fat. And protein and carbs both have 4 calories per gram. Fat will have 9. So you have to think of, if you are choosing some fuel products that might have some fat in it, a lot of ultra running food might also have some oils added in there. You'll see that the calories are going to be bumped up quite a bit. And it might just not have enough carbs to provide you the energy that you need for that workout, because fat is going to be a very, very slow source of energy. So make sure to always, when you're looking at fuel products, looking at that total carbohydrates to give yourself an idea of like, okay, am I getting enough carbs per hour to really support my, pace and performance so that I can prevent, myself from fatiguing.
I mean, I think there's the fast or slow calories there is probably an important component. My understanding is that fat absorption, first of all, will be much slower. So if you would be in a short event, drinking olive oil will really not help you. I mean, it will
Yeah,
make
it's
you
a
have
very, very slow
GI issue,
energy.
but and
Yes. Yeah,
and
it's
then
a very,
metabolic
very slow
pathways
energy.
also, and then metabolic pathways also. Carbs once absorbed also are very easily metabolized, whereas fat you'll have to have oxidation, which you have a maximum of what you can actually burn per hour. And a fast-paced short event you will not be able to sustain just on fat itself, but then you have glycogen reserve, so that's what you're going to burn. But yeah, I think to me, anything that if you count calories and you go to fat, it has to be for longer events, because otherwise you're just not getting the calories. Like, it's not as soon as you put it in your mouth it's available for your muscle, but the carbs are pretty fast.
Yeah, for ultra runners, because they're typically running at a much lower effort, a lower VO2 max, they digestively can typically handle some fuel that has some fat in it. That's why what you'll see ultra runners eating, pizza or burritos and all sorts of like wild things out on the course, because that effort level is so much lower. Their gut can typically tolerate that. Versus if you're doing, let's say marathon pace, you're going at a much higher VO2 max, much higher effort. Your heart rate is going to be higher, and your digestive system is just not going to be able to handle the protein, the higher fat stuff, because it's going to sit in your stomach longer and it's going to jostle around. You're much more likely to have some GI issues.
And even, do you recommend focusing on simple carbs for a shorter event and complex carb for a longer event, or do you make any distinction there?
For shorter events, definitely the faster digesting carbs And then if you're doing an ultra, we can do kind of a blend. I think it's nice to still have a consistent supply of those simple carbs. I'm a big fan of using like hydration mixes because digestively liquid-based carbs are much easier on the gut to get that energy digested and absorbed and used. But for those all-day events, it's really nice to have some solid food. It's a little bit of a morale booster. It's really hard to do all-day events on just liquid-based stuff or just gels. So having that little bit of mixture can be really nice to prevent flavor fatigue.
Alex, what about high peaks or high altitude events? Like, what struggles? I mean, I think everyone kind of struggles with some GI issues, potentially. They struggle with drinking, the air pressures a little bit less, so they're working harder to get oxygen. What kind of challenges nutritionally, and how can we work around those at high altitude?
Yeah, I would say the first thing before you even head to high altitude, nutritionally, I always talk with our athletes about, hey, do you know what your iron levels are, your iron stores, your ferritin? Because when you head to altitude, your body's going to immediately start producing more red blood cells, and it really needs a good iron storage baseline to help produce that. And so with our female athletes especially, we'll do an annual ferritin test, or a month or two in advance, talk about doing an iron supplement to really help build up those iron stores so that you can go into altitude ready to see those adaptations and be able to support that. And then when you head to altitude, those first few days, your metabolism actually increases by about 40%, and you use a lot more carbs as fuel than you do fat. So that's something that I make sure that our athletes are going to be fueled really well, and especially in those initial days, because your appetite will decrease, especially in that, once you head to altitude. So you have a higher metabolism and a decreased appetite. And so it's kind of a recipe for underfueling in those first few days. So being a little mindful of that to make sure that people are staying on top of nutrition. And then for the race itself, making sure that we've practiced them fueling at a really decent carb rate, because they're potentially going to be burning through carbs a little bit faster at altitude. So making sure that we've trialed handling all of that really, really well, so that they can stay well fueled during that event. And then, we've talked about hydration, I feel like, quite a bit so far. But of course, that's an important piece of it as well.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of it could be done in the training leading up to an event,
Yeah,
training the
that's
gut
exactly
to.
why I hosted the masterclass in April, was so people could start doing their homework then before they really got into those summer months.
Heat and humidity are the same thing. Like humidity, like the south. What are we thinking about for there? Obviously, the hydration, we kind of nailed that down. Drinking a little bit more, and being mindful of that. But I don't know if there's any. I don't live in humidity, fortunately. But I don't know if there's any nutritional issues with humidity.
With humidity, it increases the heat index, so it'll make it feel like it's a lot hotter than it actually is. And the thing about when you sweat in humidity is it's really hard for your body to cool when it sweats, because the sweat will actually pool on you. It doesn't just like evaporate quickly like it does in the dry heat. And so it makes you feel much warmer. And so your body temp will feel quite a bit warmer when you're in humidity. So for example, last fall, the Twin Cities Marathon got canceled the morning of the race. It was held, their race is held at the beginning of October. And here in Minnesota, it's usually really nice and cool in October, but it was 90 something degrees was the high, but the humidity was quite higher. So I think the heat index was going to be over 100 degrees. And for a lot of people, they just weren't going to be acclimated to that. And so there's a lot of health risk scares, and they ended up canceling the race that morning. And I don't blame them, because that with that heat index, it would have, there would have been a lot of people in the med tent, and it just wouldn't have been a safe situation. So you have to be a little thoughtful with the humidity. I'm sure the people from Florida that are listening will just, they get it. It just is, it's a whole different beast when there's, the dew point just ramps that humidity up.
Yeah, it's having race and humidity. you really have to factor both. And I always associate the heat and humidity. It can be really hot and dry, and then the same temperature number, well, not same temperature number, but with humidity will kind of bring it to the same level. So like a 90-degree with humidity, maybe you compare to a 110, which both are very dangerous, and both you really struggle to keep your temperature in a normal range. And of course, that means that a lot of your blood flow will go to your skin to try and produce sweat to try and cool down a little bit. But with humidity, yeah, your sweat is not evaporating. There's really only convection to cool you down. And if the temperature is already close to your body temperature, it's there's really no way to cool yourself down other than maybe
Yeah.
putting water on yourself, right? And
Yeah.
then
I
it
mean,
comes down to the same, is to try and cool yourself down. It's going to help with your digestion.
exactly. Yeah. I live in northern Minnesota, so we don't see super high temperatures very often, just for a couple weeks, usually in July. But we do get, pretty high humidity here. So when you have those really hot days that are very humid, the moment you step outside, you immediately start sweating because it's just this like blanket of hot, moist air. It's not a super pleasant experience, but it's something, that people that live in that area with humidity just deal with.
Yeah, I mean, it gets very stuffy. And yeah, as you say, it's not pleasant because you probably don't sweat more than when the temperature is really high and it's dry. It's just that you notice much more also because
Mm-hmm.
the sweat just sticks to you and sticks to
Yeah,
everything, and you
it's
just
much
really
more
get gross very
uncomfortable.
quickly. Yeah, yeah. Sometimes it feels like you jumped in water, like you're just drenched immediately. And then chafing comes, digestion problem comes. It's just not fun. Yeah, really not fun.
Yeah, I love traveling to races where there's dry heat. I'm like, oh, this is amazing. It's just a different experience.
Eh, having experienced both, I think there's a level in both direction that I think it's not pleasant anymore. When it's dry heat and it really feels like you open an oven in your face and it feels your skin is actually burning. It's like, yeah, it's dry, but that's also not fun.
I'm not saying I want to live in Arizona. I'm not saying that, but I'm
It's
but I'm saying like
that is
when I travel to
I
like
agree with
Colorado
that.
Springs in the spring, or like I've been to Montana, and I'm like, oh, this is lovely. Like I like this dry heat.
I don't know that anyone wants to live in Arizona in summer. Well, hi to all the Arizona listener, but they probably agree with me anyway. Having to have oven mittens to drive your car doesn't sound fun.
Do they really?
That's the rumor, right? I don't know if it's true. Just like in Dead Valley, they say your shoe can melt on the asphalt. Like, I
Oh,
haven't
that's wild.
seen it, but I've heard it and I want to believe it because it's miserable.
So I wanted to back up a second and talk about that first master class that you mentioned that you spoke about that you did in January, body composition, and gosh, that's a little bit of a hot topic. Always with
A little bit?
endurance
Oh,
athletes.
goodness. It is the
All right,
hot topic.
all right, a lot of it. All right, a lot of it, especially with endurance athletes. But I coach a bunch of athletes, and I always I just get these weird, not even that weird, weird inquiries. I bet you they're not weird to you because you're in that space, in the dietitian space. But why? What is the deal with like intermittent fasting, and why is it a thing? And what are people looking to get out of it, and why shouldn't endurance athletes do it?
Yeah. Oh gosh, you did open a can of worms. So I jokingly call intermittent fasting randomized starving is what I jokingly call it.
That's fair. That's fair.
For the average adult that lives a more sedentary lifestyle, there is actually solid research on using intermittent fasting as a tool for people to lose weight. So there's different styles of intermittent fasting, different varied period of times of how long you go without eating, and then it'll have a pocket of time where you are able to consume food during that time. And so what I have found with endurance athletes who are exercising most days of the week, usually for a longer duration of time, that intermittent fasting really impedes performance. Sometimes, especially if you're someone that needs to work out in the morning and that's like your fasting time, your workout is going to feel like trash. it's not going to be a great performance. You're not going to be able to see those performance gains because you're just going to be, it's going to be struggle fest day in and day out. The other piece of that too is the recovery. I think a lot of people don't put enough effort into their recovery nutrition because the training itself, that's the stress, right? And then it's the recovery afterwards. That's where we see the physical adaptations to getting stronger, to getting better endurance, better stamina, building muscle. And so you really have to be able to start that recovery process with refueling, rehydrating, getting that stress and inflammation that was caused from the workout reduced down. And recovery isn't just in that like hour, 2 hour after your workout. It's all day that you need to be supporting recovery so that you can efficiently recover from that workout and then start prepping for the next one. And so that intermittent fasting really impedes recovery. So a lot of people that have ever tried intermittent fasting with their training, if they're doing very low intensity training, they might not notice anything significant, or if their training is pretty mild. But if you start doing high volume training and intermittent fasting, you're just going to be, it's going to be a struggle fest. It's going to be tough. You're going to be putting yourself at risk for injury, for illness. Your body's going to be very stressed out. And so it's just not a good, it's just a recipe for disaster to do that. So I find consistently fueling throughout the day really helps support your energy levels, supports performance, supports recovery, and you're going to end up showing up on race day a much healthier athlete.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think it's the two angle I always push myself is not to overtrain, to include rest, and also to take care of nutrition, fueling properly for your workout, and then fueling properly for recovery. I think there's definitely not a lot of trends going against both of these. Like Brian said, intermittent fasting, never taking rest days because you're so tough. Doesn't work great for me, and I think science doesn't really support that, but it's trendy and it's on TikTok, so that's what you're supposed to do, I guess. Um, one question I would have though is also, I guess your masterclass was a lot about body composition, and as you mentioned, people trying to be a little bit leaner and changing their body composition. And how do you propose approaching that as part of a training regimen? If you have a race coming up, I mean, now we're July, probably August. You have a race that's in December, and you want to work on the body composition. Do you think that's a good idea, bad idea? How do you integrate that in your training?
Yeah, I think it's okay to want to maybe see a little bit of weight loss. And when athletes come to me and they're like, I want to lose weight, what they really mean is they want to lose that excess body fat. They want to maintain or if not build some lean muscle on them. And so that's why I like to use the word body composition. So if you hear me say weight loss, just know that I'm talking about getting leaner, getting stronger. And so it's okay for people to want to lose weight. However, I want to make sure that we do it in the healthiest way possible, which is the very slow and steady weight loss. Because if we're trying to do any like quick, drastic drop of weight, it's just going to be water weight, and you're going to see a lot of muscle loss and breakdown from that. And that's not good. And you're putting yourself at risk for injury. I also want to very much preserve people's mental health and relationship with food in their body. That is something that I've talked with so many endurance athletes about their fear of food, their fear of fueling more because they're so worried about gaining weight. If they notice they have a day or two where they're eating a lot more and they're like, oh, I had so much energy in my workout, but then the scale jumped up 2 pounds and they freak out and then they start restricting again. And there's this big epic cycle that they go through and they never end up seeing results. And so you really have to go into it strategically and finding something that you can be consistent at, because you can't just try and do something for a week or two. It has to be something that you can do long term to see that consistent, slow and steady weight loss and preserve that muscle mass and keep yourself strong and keep yourself performing really well. And so a couple things that we will do, and it's going to be a very individual approach to this, so every athlete's a little bit different, but the main trend that I see is making sure that we are not dieting during your training. Okay. A lot of athletes are like, oh, I'm going to do this workout fasted so I can burn a little bit more fat as fuel, or I'm going to not fuel as much to save myself the calories. That is the last place of your day where I want athletes dieting. I want them to fuel their workouts well so that they perform really well. They don't leave that workout underfueled and then their body's trying to catch up on nutrition later on in the day, where we see sweet cravings and hunger in the evening hours where they're tired and they're making not the greatest food choices. They're eating everything in their kitchen kind of situation. So making sure, one, I'm like, do not diet during your work training. I'm going to give you fueling guidelines and we're going to stick to them. And we will look elsewhere in our day where we can make improvements that are going to support you seeing the scale drop.
I laugh because I'll have to admit that like 20 years ago I tried some like juice cleanse diet. I lasted like 6 hours, and then at like midnight I was like shredding the cupboards apart and like eating everything in the cupboard.
Oh, I was worried you were going to say that you were in the bathroom. But yeah, I could see where.
It was only 6 hours.
Rating
It was
the
only
kitchen.
6 hours.
Okay, yeah. Anything longer than that, you would have been in the bathroom.
Yeah, I was able to get enough crackers in there to absorb some of that juice.
Good.
Well, thank you so much, Alex, for coming on. We appreciate all the great information. Where can our listeners catch up to you, get more information and insight into nutrition for endurance athletes?
Yeah, you can head to alexlarsonnutrition.com. I have my services listed there, but most importantly, I have a excellent blog. Over the past 2 years, my team and I have been doing endless writing to have a really good library of articles specifically for fueling endurance athletes. When we started writing, our goal was to create we're not competitive at all here. We're going to have the best endurance athlete nutrition blog on the internet. And so that's what we've been working on over the past 2 years. So definitely head there for resources. And if you like Instagram or Facebook or YouTube, I've got some content on there, and you can find me at Alex Larson Nutrition.
Thank you so much. We appreciate the information, and great to catch up with you, and we'll be in touch soon.
Yeah, thanks guys for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining. I'm Simon, and that's Brian.
We'd be thrilled to connect with you beyond our show.
For all of your endurance coaching requirement, you can reach out to Coach Brian at altitudeendurancecoaching.com.
To explore more of Simon's content, visit Running with Simon on YouTube.
Don't forget to rate, like, and share our content regularly.
Your support means a lot to us. Thanks.